1970, there was a significant void in the music scene of the era. The hippies, their mindset, the summer of love, all of that had ended by mid-69, with the murders by Charles Manson's family and the death of a spectator at the Altamont Festival. As early as 1968, starting with the Beatles and moving on to all the great bands of the time, psychedelia was also over. The impending death of Jimi Hendrix in September of 1970 and the dissolution of Cream at the end of '68 contributed to a situation where practically everything that we knew in the previous 3 years had almost completely disappeared. Progressive rock would gradually rise, but it was still too early for that. So the void became even more pronounced. In this situation, a group of 4 young lads from Birmingham, poor, from the depths of the working class of the worst area of the worst city in England, released an album at the beginning of the year, which, without anyone promoting it, just with the so-called word of mouth, had unexpected success, made the band known around the world, sold a lot of copies, and logically was heard by many, many musicians. Like obviously its successors that would follow very soon. In this first album, Black Sabbath haven't completely detached themselves from the psychedelic sound of the previous years. We could say that on one level, the album is heavy psych, although obviously the title track, in the way it combines the terrifying riff and occult lyrics, is pure heavy metal. So, the situation that was created in 1970 and for the next few years, and which we will examine here, is that many bands, still somewhat dependent on psychedelia, with Cream and Hendrix as their guides, but also with the success of Sabbath's heavy music as the new standard, continued to experiment, producing aggressive music and releasing heavy albums. Very few of these bands were successful. Most of them were discovered later and after the fact, which is when they were named proto-metal. Here's how I'm going to approach what happened after the release of Sabbath's first album. I'll divide the bands into 3 tiers. At the first tier will be those who achieved great success, became famous, and we all know very well who they are. I don't even know if we should be talking about proto-metal or straight heavy metal. At the second tier, I will mention a series of bands that most of us know, but, at the time, never achieved the level of success of the first-tier artists. Still, they left their mark on the people who listened to them either back then or on later times. And on the third tier, I will mention bands that had limited success, usually doing 1 or 2 albums and then disbanding, but were gradually discovered in the 90s and 2000s by lots of people with their records being re-evaluated and acquiring very significant value, both material and artistic. My report will end around 73 to 74, when new names like Kiss, AC/DC, Rainbow, Scorpions, or Judas Priest started to emerge, and one could say that from the proto-metal era, we transitioned into the heavy metal era. And one last observation before I begin. I understand that when an album is released in April or May 1970, that is after Sabbath, it could very well have been recorded, for example, in December '69 or January '70, that is, before Sabbath, and therefore not influenced by them. However, on the one hand, it's impossible for me to research such extensive details about most of the bands I'll mention here, and on the other hand, I believe that beyond the musical aspect, the success of the 4 from Birmingham somewhat changed the attitudes of rock industry professionals, making them more receptive to extremely heavy music, hence the division of my work in 2 videos. For the first tier, I think things are pretty clear. We have the holy trinity of 70s British heavy rock, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin, a little behind them Uriah Heep, and America's attempt to respond with Blue Oyster Cult and Mountain. There's not much to say here. Most of us know both the bands and their songs. Some interesting tracks, though, are Hard Lovin' Man and Fireball by Deep Purple, with the former often referred to not just as proto-metal, but as proto-thrash. And the latter being one of the earliest recorded instances of the use of the double kick drum by Ian Pace. Another interesting song that I believe fits our narrative is Bird of Prey by Uriah Heep, one of the earliest examples of solid, epic heavy metal. While in my opinion, the band that best fits the description of proto-metal is Mountain, who played the typical hard rock of the era, with quite a few keyboards and more melodic parts, but also songs that clearly flirted with proto-metal, such as the following two. Many and interesting bands can be included here. First up are the Welsh band Budgie, who never achieved great success, didn't make it in America, but had a string of great albums in the first half of the 70s and became very well known in the 80s through the recognition of their influence on bands like Metallica and Megadeth. The only objection someone might have is that they weren't playing proto-metal, they were playing pure heavy metal. I'm continuing with the British band Atomic Rooster, who played a keyboard-heavy, proggy hard rock that, especially on their second album Death Walks Behind You, September 1970, was often very close to proto-metal. A similar case is the German-British band Lucifer's Friend, who enter our discussion mainly due to their first album, which was released in January 71. Here we have a particularly aggressive hard rock as well, with dark lyrics and a menacing atmosphere. They had a great recognized influence on future metal bands such as Helloween and possibly many German power metal bands. Anyway, even though they changed their style after the first album, that one alone is enough for them to be a part of our story. Two bands featuring former members of Deep Purple will follow. Warhorse, led by bassist Nick Simper, who released 2 albums playing hard progressive rock with quite a few heavier moments and particularly dark lyrics, and Captain Beyond, led by singer Rod Evans, a mini-heavy rock supergroup that included members of Iron Butterfly as well as Johnny Winter's band. The latter are considered precursors to both heavy metal and stoner rock, with their particularly eclectic blend of proto-metal and heavy psychedelia. London's The Groundhogs had elements of both blues and progressive rock, but on their May 1970 album, Thank Christ for the Bomb, they fully enter the realm of heavy rock. The other Londoners, the Pink Fairies, are often referred to as proto-punk, mainly due to their anarchist views, but I would say that their particularly heavy for the time Never Never Land, May 1971, could easily place them in the proto-metal category as well. Finally, I will mention 2 non-Anglo-Saxon bands that were successful in their home countries without achieving anything significant outside of them. I'm talking about the Japanese band Flower Travelin' Band and the Swedish band November. The first ones are here mainly because of their second album, Satori, which was released in April 1971. It's a monolithic piece of massive proto-doom riffs overlaid with Eastern psychedelic curiosities and sparse improvisational vocals. Excluding Sabbath, we're talking about a prime contender for the heaviest album of the 70s. You can judge for yourselves. As for November, they combined delicate psychedelisms and heavy, rock-solid guitar riffs inspired by Cream, singing in Swedish. They are mentioned because they are one of the first heavy rock bands from a country that has offered and continues to offer a great deal to this musical genre. Way too many bands belong here. My initial selection of bands to mention returned 50 names, and that is leaving some bands out. Obviously, I had to cut something else too. As you can understand, it's very likely that those who are well versed in the subject won't find some bands they might have been expecting. I hope it's clear why this is happening. I'll start with a pair that are often mentioned together and are perhaps the most classic example of what I'm talking about. They are the New Yorkers, Sir Lord Baltimore, and the Londoners, Leafhound. Both are considered among the most classic examples of bands we discovered later, mainly in relation to their albums Kingdom Come, December 1970, and Growers of Mushroom, October 1971, respectively. In fact, the first of the two has the first recorded reference to its music as heavy metal, in its review in the March 1971 issue of Cream magazine. As for the second, it has often been called Proto Stoner, while an authentic first pressing copy was sold in 2021 for £11,000. I will follow this pair with a list of other later recognized proto-metal artists. Bang from Philadelphia with their eponymous album, Dust from New York with their eponymous debut, and Hard Attack, the Canadian-British May Blitz, with two significant heavy rock releases in 70 and 71. The Londoners Stray, mainly with their self-titled debut, Lincoln Street Exit from the New Mexico Desert with Drive It, Hard Stuff with their 1972 Bulletproof. The incredibly heavy New Yorkers, Haystacks Balboa with another eponymous debut, the London-based steel mill, not Bruce Springsteen's band, Heaven Forbid, with their Green-Eyed God, Pooh Bah from Ohio with their particularly Sabbath-esque Let Me In from 1972, their compatriots Damnation of Adam Blessing, with two excellent examples of heavy psychedelic occult rock, both of which were released in 1970. The Californian band Fraction with their awesome Moon Blood from 1971. The raw psychedelic masters Samuel Prodi from Brighton, Power of Zeus from Detroit with their The Gospel According to Zeus of 1970, and finally Negative Space from New Jersey with their fuzzed-out heavy rock of Hard, Heavy, Mean, and Evil, released in May 1970. Now, out of curiosity, I will mention together bands whose names start with J. The Texans Josephus, the Londoners Jericho, or Jericho Jones, Jerusalem from Salisbury, Geronimo from Germany, and Londoners Jody Grind. I don't know why the proto-metalers of the era liked the letter J so much, probably something to do with the sound. Clearly, the heaviest of them all are Josephus, who in fact have one of the most metal covers ever for the time it came out for their Dead Man album of 1970, and Jerusalem perhaps because they were the last chronologically to release an album in 1972. If we go down to the Southern Hemisphere now, we find the Australian band Buffalo, whose album Volcanic Rock is, in my opinion, the closest companion competitor to Black Sabbath, and the New Zealand band Human Instinct, who probably accidentally invented stoner rock 20 years before Monster Magnet, with an excellent example of jamming Hendrix-esque guitar that was released in the summer of 1970 and had the obvious title Stoned Guitar. Of course, some journalists would disagree with this view and insist that stoner rock was invented by Primeval from Indiana and their album Smoking Bats at Campton's, which was released in January 1974. A very special case is the South African band Suck, who existed as a group for 8 months between 70 and 71 when they released their only album, Time to Suck, where they play dipped in heavy psychedelia covers by Donovan, Free, Colosseum, King Crimson, Deep Purple, and for the first time in the history of recorded music, Black Sabbath, War Pigs. They have been called the Lost Pioneers of Heavy Metal, while the style they play was dubbed acid punk metal.
Generals gathered in their masses.
Since we're in the Southern Hemisphere, let's also take a look at the very dynamic South American scene, with bands like Pax and Tarkus from Peru, Manal, Pescado Rabioso, Aquelarre, Color Humano, Papo's Blues, Piel de Pueblo, Vox Dei, Billy Bond, Y La Pesada del Rock and Roll from Argentina, Dias de Blues from Uruguay, and Agua Turbia from Chile. In this scene, depending on the record you buy, you can find generous quantities of blues, psychedelia, boogie rock, and proto-metal on albums that were very, very heavy for their time. Some of you may know that back in the early 70s, in West Germany, appeared a very unique wave of artists who combined psychedelia with elements from the avant-garde, hypnotic rhythms, improvisations, and elements of the then nascent electronic music scene. These artists were given a term that was initially used rather disparagingly, but in the end, stuck: krautrock. The thing is, the scene also had many bands that combined the elements of its sound with heavy rock, giving us something that has often been called proto-metal. I would like to mention Frumpy from Hamburg, Message and German Oak from Dusseldorf, Tiger B. Smith from Frankfurt, Hairy Chapter, possibly the heaviest of them all, from Bonn 2066, and then from Mannheim, Gift from Augsburg, My Solid Ground from Russelsheim, and Armageddon from Berlin. Perhaps the best-known bands of all are Birth Control, also from Berlin, mainly for their albums Operation from 1971 and Hoodoo Man from 1972, and a small band from Hanover with a 16-year-old wonder guitarist, which perhaps you might know. The case of guitarist Randy Holden is very special. After spending some time as a member of Blue Cheer, he released the album Population 2, which was printed in very few copies and sold out very quickly. He then left the music scene. But the album's fame grew, to the point where people wondered if it actually existed or was an urban legend. Indeed, various bootleg versions of it were released in the 1990s, with very poor sound quality, until finally we had a limited vinyl edition in 2005 and the remastered CD in 2008. What's playing on this record by Holden? A crazy slab of acid-fried guitar mayhem backed by 16 200-watt amplifiers. Imagine how far the whole phenomenon of rediscovered bands has gone, as we include bands that had no official releases during the period we're examining, but later made some archival releases in the form of compilations of songs recorded many years earlier. For example, Stone Axe from Houston, who had only released one single, Wicked Lady, from Northampton, with two archival releases in the 90s, Necromandus from Egremont, who were considered as the backing band for Ozzy Osbourne's first incarnation of the Blizzard of Oz, and JPT Scare Band from Kansas City. Special mention should be made for their compatriots, Bulbous Creation, who recorded various songs between 1969 and 1970, which were eventually released as the compilation You Won't Remember Dying in 1994. Their music is typical heavy psych of the era, but what's impressive is the intensely blasphemous lyrics in songs like Satan or Under the Black Sun. I'll conclude with two very specific references. The Icelandic band Ice Cross released their self-titled debut in April 1973, and according to many pundits, their chilling, horrifying, morbid, and particularly heavy sound anticipates both doom metal and black metal, many years before they came into existence. Obviously, there is an unusual use of dark lyrics for the time. You can listen and judge for yourself.
They believe in Jesus. We believe. Have you ever had a dream about?
Now, as a Greek, I want to mention a local band that I believe was an important piece of the heavy psych, hard rock, proto-metal universe we examined in these two videos. I'm talking about Socrates Drank the Conium, featuring Yannis Spathas on guitar and Antonius Turkogeorgis on bass and vocals. The band started playing in 1969 and then released 3 consecutive albums in 71, 72, and 73. Of course, at that time in Greece, and due to the political situation in the country, there was a time lag in what was being played here compared to what was being played globally. So, the first Socrates album, with its very strong blues tone, was more something that would have suited 1968 than 1971. Gradually, with Taste of Conium in '72 and On the Wings in '73, the heavy psych, hard rock elements in the band's sound became more apparent, resembling many of the bands we mentioned in this second video. Something I'm mentioning as a postscript because it falls outside the video's time frame is the release in 1976 of an album by a band from Athens called The Four Levels of Existence. This was their first, and as it turned out last, self-titled album. This album presents the typical fuzzed-out heavy psych of the 70-71 era, which, again, due to the circumstances in my country, ended up being released in 1976 and went unnoticed. The band quickly broke up, remaining completely unknown for many years, until gradually, along with all the bands we mentioned earlier, this release was discovered and is now one of the most sought-after releases for record collectors of that era worldwide. If someone has an original pressing of this record, it could fetch a particularly respectable sum if he decided to sell. We're talking close to €2,000. And I'll conclude with a second postscript. In March 1970, the British band Black Widow from Leicester released Sacrifice. It's a case of an artist essentially very similar to Coven from the previous video, atmospheric, progressive, catchy, almost cinematic, occult rock with lyrics that could have been written by King Diamond. Was it influential? Certainly. Was it heavy? Not at all. Another addition to the kaleidoscope of very unique sonic proposals of that era.